New Zealand, and welcome to another episode of Wreck and Roll. My name is Mark Pacey. I'm your host today from the Wairarapa archive, and we are going through 4 more shipwreck stories. Today we are getting stuck straight into it. This is the story of, and find my page, the Addenda. So the Addenda was an American 4-masted wooden barkentine. She was built in Oregon in 1895 by the Simpson Lumber Company. She was 637 tons and 176 feet in length. The Addenda arrived in Littleton on the 5th of September 1904 after sailing from Coos Bay in Oregon. On board she had a cargo of pine, 783,000 feet of it. She had experienced some rough weather on the trip but made it safely to port. From here she sailed north on the 13th of October, bound for Wellington. Then the details get a little murky. A telegram was received in Wellington from Martinborough, which described a large vessel which had come ashore in Palliser Bay. It is reported by telephone from Pedanoa that a 4-masted ship is ashore at Palliser Bay near Lake Ferry. Efforts are being made to launch a boat by residents, but owing to the roughness of the sea, it has so far been found impractical. Men can be seen on the deck of the ship. No particulars are available as to identify the vessel. Shortly after, it was confirmed that the vessel that had come ashore was the Addenda, but any further details were still lacking. It wasn't until the 17th of October that the facts came out, when the Addenda's Captain Astrup made a statement, which was published in the press. After sailing from Littleton, the Addenda found herself in a gale that continued to intensify. They had thought they were near Cape Campbell in Marlborough, but at 3 a.m. Astrup discovered that he was, as he later wrote in his log, hopelessly involved in the jaws of Palliser Bay. As day broke, sails were raised to try and get the Addenda away from the coast, but the winds ripped them away and the barkentine was forced in, coming to rest 50 yards from shore. Crewman Charles Malm jumped overboard with a rope to secure it to the shore to allow the rest of the crew a safe passage. Malm was soon in difficulty due to the strong undertow. He was joined in the water by second mate London, and together they made it to the beach, securing the line. The rest of the crew were then able to make it safely to shore. The adventure was far from over. They had survived the stranding, but were now cold and hungry with no easy solution to their plight. They were alone on their beach. They did manage to signal the Lake Ferry Hotel, but the lagoon that separated them and the weather made it too rough to cross. They decided to set out on foot. They made for Young Station, but missed the road and ended up well off course. They had been walking for 17 hours and had still not seen a soul. They did see a sheep, who was minding her own business until the hungry castaways spotted her, and thoughts turned to an easy meal. But whereas the Addenda's crew had been walking for hours and were cold and exhausted, the sheep was well rested and easily escaped them. The hungriest of the men had resorted to eating seaweed instead. One even ate his tobacco, which he said was sweet and palatable. It can't have been too bad, as he did not become sick from consuming it. The Addenda's cook by this time had had enough of the adventure and started the walk back to the wreck, and was rescued by the staff from the Lake Ferry Hotel. After the rest of the crew trekked further, a horse was spotted wearing a cover. There had to be people nearby. But what they found wasn't a dwelling or a camp, but a river, swollen with the rains. 2 of the crew made it across and found a small hut with 2 men inside, who immediately came to the aid of the rest of the Addenda's crew. All of them, even a young member who was weak with hunger and had to be carried, made it safely to the hut. Over the next few days, trips were made back to the Addenda as men recovered what they could from her. Many of these items, predominantly clothes, were stored in a nearby woolshed for collection later. The beach was described as being strewn with wreckage and the dead bodies of seabirds killed in the storm. The captain made his way to Wellington, but word reached him of a further tragedy to occur to his ship. At some point, persons unknown visited the wreck, and they found a large portion of cargo and supplies had been neatly stored in a wool shed, which they proceeded to plunder. If it wasn't bad enough that the men had lost their ship, opportunistic thieves had now stolen their clothes. An official inquiry was put off due to the Addenda being a foreign vessel. The wreck was put up for sale and was purchased by Mr. McDougall of Pirinoa. Several attempts were made to recover the Addenda and refloat her over the next few months, but the force of the waves quashed every attempt. Too much time and money had been spent on trying to save her, and she was given up as a lost cause. 2 years after her stranding, she was reduced to a battered hulk. Talk now turned to setting her remains on fire so the copper could be extracted. A few months later, she was in 3 pieces, slowly breaking up in the surf. By 1917, she was reported to have practically disappeared from the beach. In the wake of the Addenda's stranding, the Evening Post painted a rather grim picture of Palliser Bay's history with shipping. Palliser Bay had probably been the scene of more shipwrecks than any other part of the New Zealand coast. Palliser Bay is exposed to the full force of a southerly gale, and its cape has often been mistaken in thick weather for Wellington Heads. The Addenda had not entirely disappeared, however. What was left was buried beneath the sand, safe from the elements and further deterioration. But it was not the elements that were the greatest risk. In 2009, moving sands exposed her hull, and a rare glimpse was offered of a 19th century barkentine, one of the few wrecks that is periodically visible in Wairarapa. Department of Conservation staff were horrified to discover that holes had been dug around the Addenda's remains and pieces cut off. After a fateful stranding and then enduring the conditions for a century, the biggest threat to the Addenda, now a protected site, doesn't come from the elements, but from souvenir hunters. Right, we're now going to play you a piece of music. All going well, this works. I'm going to put on my headphones just to make absolutely sure. So for those of you who don't speak Gaelic, this is Alien by Manran, and it actually does translate, so I'm told, into shipwreck. It is a song about a shipwreck, but it is entirely in Gaelic, so we'll give this one a go. Hopefully it works. Right, straight back into it. We are now on to the story of Rona. The Ben Avon became wrecked in 1903, sinking in the waters of Palliser Bay, but she also took with her much of her cargo, and several salvage operations took place over her grave. One such salvage mission was conducted by the Rona. The Rona was a New Zealand-built scow, 65 feet long and 35 tons. She was constructed in 1904 for Bartolo Russo of Rona Bay and was initially used for shipping around the Lower Hutt, Wellington area. The following year she ventured out from Wellington waters up the east coast to collect a load of timber. When off the coast of Arkitio, she was blown ashore and received some damage, but was quickly refloated. On 25th of March 1909, Rona set out from Wellington with a crew of 6 for the wreck of the Ben Avon. The Rona was suited for harbour sailing, but was later revealed to have been in poor condition, and not at all suited for the kinds of seas that could be expected on the Wairarapa coast. After leaving Wellington, nothing more was heard or seen of the Rona. To all those concerned, the ship had disappeared. Several days after she had gone missing, it was decided that a search should be mounted to find out what became of the scow. Sebastian Newson, manager of the salvage company, and Bartolo Russo told the public that there was no need for worry. The Rona was a good vessel, manned by a competent crew. Should the Rona not be found in Palliser Bay, then her crew would have sailed her to Castle Point for shelter. By 30th of March, still no word had been heard of the missing scow. Police were calling other stations to see if anyone knew anything. Anticipating that something may have happened, Russo insured the ship for £250. Newson, having received a new diving suit, declared his intention to take this and resume salvage operations at the Ben Avon site. Meanwhile, the fate of the Rona was still uncertain. On the 1st of April, a week after the Rona sailed, word was received that the crew were safe ashore, and the story of their plight came out. The ship had arrived at the Ben Avon site the same day that she had sailed from Wellington and moored to the rock at the wreck site. The crew then went ashore, set up a rough hut in which to store some provisions. Later that night, the weather picked up and the crew made for land again. The Rona, still tethered to the rock, turned about in the surf and broke free. She was then washed ashore, coming to rest in the mouth of the Mangatoitoi River. The crew were able to make tents from sailcloth and sheltered out of the weather until they were able to make contact. News of the crew's safety was further delayed due to the lack of adequate communication equipment from Palliser Lighthouse. In the days that followed, Russo and a representative of the salvage company visited the site of the Rona. They reported in an evening post on the 3rd of April 1909 that the ship was in good condition and quite salvageable, and that the crew were happy to stay on and complete their work. They had travelled up to Palliser Bay on board the Duco, which was there to install a much-needed telegraph wire to the lighthouse. A report in the New Zealand Times on 17th of April could not have been more different. An assessor had inspected the Rona and said that she was well beyond saving. There was no reason for the crew to remain, as they had no supplies, no ship, and some didn't even have boots. An inquiry was made into the stranding of the Rona, and as the evidence was heard, it was Newson that received the blame. He had willingly sent out a vessel that was not seaworthy and endangered the crew on board. The New Zealand Truth newspaper published a scathing article on Newson, calling him a dirty, despicable dog who ought to be towed by a rope from the stern of a trawler to chase fish. He was fined an initial £30 plus £10 in costs. The Rona, meanwhile, succumbed to the elements, and by early May the papers reported her as quite a hopeless wreck. Later that month, the Duco, the ship that had brought Russo to the ship 6 weeks previously, began her own salvage operations on the Ben Avon. And straight into the next one. This is shipwreck number 47. This is the SS Ripple. The SS Ripple was built in 1905 by Van Vliet and Company in Hardiksveld, Gijsendam in the Netherlands. She was 141 feet long and weighed 413 tons loaded. Her first owner was the Shipping Investment Company of London. In 1906, she was sold to the Canterbury Steamship Company of New Zealand and was engaged in the coastal trade. In 1910, the SS Ripple undertook weekly trips to the Chatham Islands, taking mail and supplies over with her. That same year, she was sold to Richardson and Company of Napier and was then occupied in the trade of goods from Wellington to Napier and collecting wool from stations on the return trip. In 1914, William Cole was employed as a dockside worker in Gisborne and was helping to unload cargo from the SS Ripple. Tragedy struck when he was crushed by a sling of railway sleepers and died from his injuries. He left a widow and 7 children. The following year, the SS Ripple transported 16 acts of the Baker Brothers Circus to Gisborne. The acts included the Globe of Death, where 3 motorcyclists loop the loop in a 22-foot diameter steel sphere, Jackals and his canine workers, Frank the Equestrian Marvel, and the intriguingly titled Miss Gertie's Dental Act. In 1923, another dockside accident occurred when a gas cylinder that was being loaded aboard the SS Ripple exploded. The escaping gas ignited and 6 workers were injured, 2 of them seriously. The SS Ripple's last mission left Wellington Harbour at 3:25 p.m. on the 6th of August 1924. The weather was not ideal, but the SS Ripple's Captain Norling decided it was safe enough to leave. 2 other vessels, one of them smaller than the SS Ripple, also left that same day. The SS Ripple steamed out into the open sea and was observed at 11:56 p.m. off the coast by the keeper at the Cape Palliser Lighthouse. Just 24 minutes later, the lighthouse keeper received a Morse message from the SS Ripple asking for assistance. The message was forwarded to Wellington by the lighthouse keeper. At this stage, it was not known what the emergency was. At 1 a.m., another message was sent from the SS Ripple asking if help was on the way. The lighthouse keeper confirmed that he had contacted Wellington, but still the SS Ripple did not elaborate on what the emergency was. The lighthouse keeper kept the ship in sight the whole time. At 1:40 a.m., the lights from the SS Ripple, which were now 8 kilometres offshore, went out. The SS Ripple had travelled an estimated 10 kilometres from when the first message at 11:56 p.m. to when the ship's lights disappeared. The following day, the steamer Mararoa spent 8 hours searching the area of Cape Palliser looking for the SS Ripple. No sign of the ship or any of the 17 crew on board were found. That night, the trawler Futurist and the steamer Kaitoki also searched for any sign of the SS Ripple, but found none. 3 days later, the SS Ripple disappeared. That doesn't make sense. 3 days after the SS Ripple had disappeared, wreckage started to wash up near Castle Point. At Otohome Beach, 5 kilometres south of Castle Point, searchers found something more poignant. A body, which was later identified as that of Captain Norling, had washed up. He was partially clothed and evidently had tried to swim to shore. An empty lifeboat and 2 lifebelts also washed up, but no survivors were ever found. The following month, it was thought that evidence of what had happened to the SS Ripple had been found. A tin washed up at Wairarapa, look inside, had been scratched onto the lid. When it was opened, a scrap of paper was found within. In a boat with sail sinking, Ripple was written on it. This was later declared a hoax. A year after the SS Ripple disappeared, a bottle was found washed up at Mohaka Beach, halfway between Napier and Mahia. In it was another message: SS Ripple, engine trouble, dark and stormy night, sinking fast. One boat got away, but don't think it will reach the shore. Engineer Nielsen. This was again found to be a hoax. Not only did the handwriting not match the apparent creator, but his name was spelled wrong. An inquiry found that the SS Ripple was justified in setting off the day that it did, and that the condition of the ship and the way the cargo had been loaded was adequate. No one was to blame for the loss. After the passing of years, the SS Ripple faded from the headlines and became forgotten. She is still out there somewhere, resting quietly beneath the waves, the final resting place for the sailors that went down with her. Right, time for our next piece of music. I'm going to consult my notes so I get this right. This was mentioned to me by a few people, including Mum. Thank you. Said, why don't you play the theme of the Oneiden line? So this piece of music was written by Aram Kachachurian, originally in 1954, but was later reused as the theme of the Oneiden line. So this is the Oneiden line. Right, on to our last story for the day. This is the Opua. The steamer Opua was built in Glasgow in 1902 and was first owned by the North Coast Steam Navigation Company based in Sydney. She was 184 feet long, 575 tonnes fully loaded, and was originally called the Ramorini. Upon arrival in Australia, she served as a passenger and cargo vessel sailing from Sydney up the north coast, becoming a well-known vessel of the area. In 1907, a suspicious rat was caught on the Ramorini. A study of this was found it was infected with the plague, a disease which still kills people each year. Tragedy struck 10 years later when she sprung a leak and had to be beached south of Yamba in northeastern New South Wales. After a few weeks, Ramorini was refloated and taken to the Clarence River for repairs. July of 1919, the Ramorini was sold to the Western Australian buyers, ending 17 years of service in the North Coast Steam Navigation Company. Her service in the West was not going to be a long-term relationship. Just 13 months after her purchase, it was announced that she had been sold to Dutch buyers in Java. But a few months later, the sale was cancelled. She then served as a trading vessel between Fremantle and Java in Indonesia. At the beginning of 1921, Ramorini was sold again, but this time it was heading south. Her new owners were Rees Brothers of Christchurch. She had recently been overhauled in Sydney and was given a new paint job. To go with her updated look, she was also given a new name. From the beginning of her new life in New Zealand, she was the Opua. History repeated itself in November 1924 when the Opua ran aground at Cape Farewell, the most southerly point of the South Island. The weather was hazy with rain, so visibility was poor. It was also said that a split had grown in length since it was last surveyed. The Opua was floated off the height the next tide and arrived in Greymouth the following morning with no damage. 2 years later, the Opua would become beached for a third time, but her luck had run out. This time the stranding was permanent. In the early hours of 4th of October 1926, the Opua was travelling south from Gisborne to Wellington. When sailing into South Wairarapa, she encountered a heavy fog. Steaming past Tora, the Opua ran into some of the treacherous rocks there and was soon stranded amongst them. With no immediate chance of refloating, some of the crew went ashore. Captain Fowler and his senior crew remained on board. Those that went ashore were invited to a lunch at Eric Riddiford's homestead nearby. By 3 p.m, the last of those on board the Opua decided she was too far gone and made for land. The seas by this time were getting rougher and were dangerous to the men in their small lifeboat. A line had been run from the Opua to the shore and the men were able to follow this. Despite the wreck being just 90 metres offshore, it took the captain's boat half an hour to make it to safety. 2 tugs, the Toya and Terafiti, arrived at the site that afternoon. An inspection of Opua showed the hull had been ruptured badly by the rocks, and, as it was a single-layered hull, any attempts to pull the Opua into deeper water would result in the ship sinking, and the salvage was abandoned. The following day, the entire crew was safe in Wellington. The Opua was not going to be saved this time. In the days that followed, the ship was driven further inshore, her hull receiving more damage from the rocks. On the 14th of October, the New Zealand Herald reported that the wreck of the Opua had been sold to Eric Riddiford, whose property overlooked the wreck site. The following February, an auction was held selling off fittings and scrap metal which had been salvaged from the wreck. The rest of the hulk was left where it was, and can still be seen off the shore of Tora, slowly being reclaimed by the sea. Alright, that's it for me today, but of course I have to end with a joke. I have a friend in Wellington who's waiting patiently for this joke. They really, really love this type of humour. So, for you, you know who you are, this is just for you. Can you pick up my boat? It's at the dock. Oh no, is it sick? You should give it some vitamin C. Absolutely brilliant. All right, that's it for me today. We will catch up with you next Monday, same rec time, same rec channel. So until then, have a wonderful week.